Good evening. This is Mr. Barr. Thanks for tuning in tonight. This is the second part of our state government examination, I guess. Last week, you were supposed to focus on the state legislative branch. I'll get more into that in just a second and why I chose that first, and then I'll get into the rest of state government tonight. Just a reminder, though, that all this learning is voluntary. It's new learning. It's something we would have covered anyway. We'd obviously all rather be at school, but unfortunately, this pandemic has other things in mind. So if you're wondering if it's required, it's not. I'll give you feedback if you submit the stuff, but it's not required. So feel free to tune in, though, and learn something new about state government. Last week, you spent your time on the legislative branch, and the legislative branch is important. Just like the national legislature, the Iowa legislature's job is to make laws for the state of Iowa. That makes sense. That's what the legislature does. The challenge is, during this pandemic, they're really not in session now. Usually they go from January to May, and they're done for the year. They can get their work done and then go back home. A lot of these people have other jobs. The problem, though, is with the pandemic, they've delayed their session. So the legislature still hasn't really done much of its work. They were kicked out of Des Moines before they could really complete a lot of their work. So a lot of the things the legislature usually does hasn't been done yet, and that's not necessarily their fault. So we're going to kind of shift gears here and really that's why I want to do a video exclusively for the executive and judicial branch, because they're still in function, and good grief, the governor's on TV every day. So let's talk about the state executive branch. First off, it's important to remember that the chief executive in every state is called the governor. Now, the United States is a weird nation because we have three commonwealths, which are Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and Kentucky. What's the difference? Good question. Essentially, it's how it's set up and its charter. Really nothing from our standpoint. They operate a little different in terms of their government, but for the most part, a commonwealth and a state are exactly the same thing. So, but regardless, the person that leads that state or commonwealth is called the governor. That's also true for the territories: Puerto Rico, Guam, Virgin Islands, Samoa, and Northern Mariana Islands. Anyway, so that person is called the governor in every state. In most states, you have to be 30. Iowa's included in that, so to be governor of Iowa, you have to be 30. But 7 states, ironically, I don't remember which 7 they are, allow you to actually be 18. So some of you watching this could be the governor of a state, which, depending on the circumstance, could be a great thing or could be a terrifying thing. But there are some states that don't have a minimum age requirement. You can theoretically be 18 and be governor of that state, but that's only 7. Most require that a candidate lives in the state. Obviously, we're not going to let you be governor of Iowa and live in a different state. That doesn't make sense. How long varies by state. Some say 10 years. Some you can move 30 days before the election and be the governor of that state. To be the governor of Iowa, let's look exclusively at Iowa here. To be the governor of Iowa, a person has to be 30 years old, a resident of the United States, and a resident of Iowa for 2 years. Now, going back here, a citizen of the United States, that's a lot different than the presidential requirements. To be president of the United States, you have to be 35, a natural-born citizen, and a resident of the U.S. for 14 years. So at the state level, we've taken away the natural-born citizenship requirement. So a guy like Arnold Schwarzenegger was the governor of California, but he could not be president of the United States without a constitutional amendment changing that natural-born citizenship requirement. Okay, so it's an important distinction. Natural-born, you're born in the United States, a territory on a military base overseas. A U.S. citizen, you can be born anywhere and have U.S. citizenship and still be the governor of Iowa. The current governor of Iowa, as I'm sure many of you know, is Kim Reynolds. Now, Kim Reynolds is unique for lots of reasons. One, she's the first female governor of Iowa. So in our whole history of this state, she's the first female to ever hold that office. Second, she's also the only governor to ever finish her college degree while she was holding office. So she's unique in that sense. Now, Kim Reynolds became governor when the previous governor, Terry Branstad, left office to go be Donald Trump's ambassador to China, and still is, by the way. So she was lieutenant governor. She ascended to the office and became governor, and then was elected to her own term in 2018. So she is the first female governor of the state of Iowa. She's the 43rd and current governor. You've probably seen her. She's on television every day, but there's a picture of her on your screen for your reference. In most states, the governor serves 4-year terms. There might be a couple of states where it's 2. Iowa used to have just a 2-year term for governor, and then we changed it to 4 early in the late 80s, we changed it. That way we could it just made more sense in terms of fitting with the legislature and things like that. But in most states, the governor serves a 4-year term. Most states also term limit the governor to no more than 2 terms. Iowa doesn't do that. You can actually be governor of Iowa as many times as you want. Terry Branstad, the guy that was governor before Kim Reynolds, was governor for actually almost 24 years. In fact, he was the longest serving governor in the history of the country. Think about that. Of all the governors in the history of America, from the founding of the republic to right now, Terry Branstad, the governor of Iowa, served longer than anybody. Now, he was elected originally in 1983, and he served 4 terms and retired in 1999 to go be president of Des Moines University. And then we had Tom Vilsack for 8 years, and then Chet Culver for 4. So 12 years of Democrats. And then after Chet Culver in 2010, Terry Branstad decided to run for governor again and was elected to 2 full terms again as governor. He didn't finish the second one because he was nominated to be ambassador to China, and the rest is history. But in Iowa, you can be governor for as many terms as you want. Some people think that's a great thing because the people should be able to choose who they want. Other people say, no, that's awful, right? Like, it puts more pressure on the governor to get things done if they know they only have 4 years or 8 years to get it done. But Iowa does not term limit their governor. Like the president, the governor is the chief executive of the state, so they do have certain roles and powers. The governor's main role, just like the president's, is to lead the executive branch, enforce state law. Okay. Governor is the commander-in-chief of the state's National Guard. It's like the president's the commander-in-chief of the U.S. military. The governor is the commander-in-chief of the state's National Guard. Now, you're seeing that right now. Governor Reynolds is all these test Iowa sites she's setting up, and she's using the National Guard to deliver PPE and testing supplies to all these nursing homes and packing plants in areas of the state where we know there's some virus activity. It's called surveillance testing. She's using the National Guard to help with that a lot. So she's activated the National Guard under her power as commander-in-chief and is going to continue to do so if she needs to. They'll also activate them in things like storms, hurricanes, things like that. Like the president, the governor is required to report to the legislature. The president's speech is called the State of the Union, and it's kind of his yearly goals for the country. That's the one where Nancy Pelosi famously tore it up this past January. For the governor at the state level, that's called the condition of the state. Same thing, same idea. They lay out their priorities for that term, but it's just called the condition of the state address. Governors have the right to veto bills, just like the president. In fact, it's one of the most important powers that they have in the Constitution is to veto laws because it gives them a leverage over the legislature. Now, the governor has a unique type of veto power. In 44 states, the governor has what's called a line item veto. All right, now at the federal level, if the president wants to veto a bill, he vetoes the whole bill or none of it, right? It's all or nothing. You take what's in it or you don't take what's in it, right? You either sign it or you veto it. At the state level, though, the governor has the unique ability to veto parts of a bill without vetoing the whole bill. So if the Iowa legislature passes a bill, and let's say there's 5 things in it that Kim Reynolds is just disgusted by, but I've always said, and I'll say this quote again, there's 2 things in the world that you don't want to show people how you make them, laws and sausages. Lawmaking is ugly. Sometimes there's stuff thrown into bills that doesn't make sense. The coronavirus, the CARES Act, the last big coronavirus bill they did, there was a provision in there to give $25 million to the Kennedy Center. Does the Kennedy Center for Performing Arts, which is a wonderful place, I've seen a play there, it's fantastic, but that has very little to do with COVID-19. How did it end up in the bill? That's the way legislating works. People need to get that into the bill to get points from their constituents, to get votes, to get whatever, notoriety, fame, whatever, okay? The president can't do anything about that. He either signs the bill, accepts it, and swallows it, which is what they do most of the time, or he vetoes it and cancels the whole bill. Sometimes you got to draw a line and do that. The governor, though, could take 5 things that they disagree with, and they can literally just cross out each line. A line item can just be crossed out. Now, there's a couple of restrictions. They can't change the money. Okay, so if the legislature allocates $3 million and she says, no, I only want to allocate $1 million. No, you don't get to do that. But you can cross it off if you don't like it. The other thing is the legislature can override those line items, but they have to have a 2/3 vote. And again, trying to get 51% is tough, let alone 2/3, right? So the line item veto is really, really an important thing. Why doesn't the federal government have the line item veto? It's a good question. And in 1996, we did. Bill Clinton had it for a little while. It was challenged in court. It made it all the way to the Supreme Court, and essentially they ruled it unconstitutional because they felt it was the executive impeding on the job of the legislature by changing laws. That's not their job. So just understand, the governor can veto, just like the president can. The difference is the governor can veto individual parts of a bill without having to veto the whole thing, and that's an important difference. Governors appoint judges to state courts. They can change criminal sentences. They can issue pardons and commutations, just like the president. Upon the death of the governor, in most states, the lieutenant governor becomes the governor. Iowa's certainly the case. So if something happened to Kim Reynolds, excuse me, Adam Gregg would become the governor. Like the federal government, the executive branch has a number of departments, agencies, and boards. Some are similar to the federal government. There's a Department of Labor, Justice, of Agriculture. There's a Treasury Department. Stuff like that. Others are specific to the state and to its needs. For example, the Department of Health and Department of Public Works. Some of those vary by states. Different states have departments that other states don't because those states need those. Okay, like California has a film department because there's so many films made in California, right? They want them regulated and controlled and to meet certain guidelines from the state, so they have a separate department for that. Iowa doesn't. At the federal level, the heads of these agencies, or most of them, are appointed by the president, right? They're appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate. At the state level, that's true still. The governor, most of them are independent. The governor does play a role in appointing people to lead agencies, departments, and boards. For example, they appoint the head of the Department of Education, the head of the Department of Revenue, the head of there's a bunch of departments that they do appoint the person to lead. But the main ones, the big executive branch departments, are not chosen by the governor. They're elected by the people. Okay, most states have 5 major executive officials. One is called the Secretary of State. They keep the official records, they oversee elections, and they record and publish all public laws. 2 is the Attorney General, who's the state's chief lawyer. The 3rd one is the state treasurer. They handle and keep track of the flow of money. The 4th one is the state auditor. They review the conduct of departments and offices within the state. And then 5 is the Department of Education, which oversees the state's public education system. Iowa does not actually elect their Department of Education person. They're appointed by the governor. So understand, the Secretary of State, the State Treasurer, the State Attorney General, the State Auditor, and the Secretary of Agriculture are all elected by the people. So when you go vote in November, you're going to have a Democrat and a Republican candidate perhaps for Attorney General on the ballot, whatever offices are up. Secretary of State, I know, is up. So Paul Pate, the Republican, is going to run for re-election, and he's going to have a Democrat opponent, and they're going to run, and whoever wins is the Secretary of State. So you can have a Republican governor and all Democrat office holders. Right? That happens sometimes. The Attorney General is a guy named Tom Miller. He's a wonderful man, but he's been in office for 30-some years, and he's been the Attorney General. He's a Democrat. So, I mean, and we've had Republican governors a lot. So it doesn't really matter who the governor is. Those offices are elected by the people. So you will see a Democratic candidate for treasurer, a Republican candidate for treasurer, a Democratic candidate for auditor, a Republican candidate for auditor. And those are weird things to elect, but we do. We elect those offices at the state level. Again, all of these offices in most states are not appointed by the governor. They operate as independent agencies and are elected by the people. Let's move to the judicial branch. Each state has 2 sets of courts, usually lower courts and higher courts. Depends on the state, but usually that's what they're called. They hear different cases depending on the severity and complexity of that case. The state Supreme Court is always the court of last resort. So if a person loses an appeal in the state Supreme Court and believes the ruling violated his or her constitutional rights, they can appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, but they can't appeal to another state court. Once it's done in state, that's it. If you want to appeal to the federal level, you can, if you think it answers a federal question or deals with a federal issue. Like the Colorado case where the baker refused to bake a cake for a same-sex couple, that violated a Colorado state law that argued that was discrimination. He sued in state court. State court said it's discrimination. You can't refuse to bake a cake for a same-sex couple. He challenged that in federal court, arguing that that violated his First Amendment right to freedom of religion. It was hashed out in federal court. The Supreme Court decided in favor of the baker. You can make, on religious grounds, refuse to accept it. Now, he offered to make him a cake. There's all sorts of complications with that case. So sometime talk to me and we'll dive into that case. But the idea here is that you can't appeal it at the state level once the Supreme Court's decided it at the state. You got to go to the federal level. Okay. Some judges are appointed by governors, state legislatures, or the state Supreme Court, or city officials. Some judges are elected by voters, and some are a combination of the two processes. You're in luck because an elected official might choose a judge for his or her first term on the bench, and if the judge is seeking a new term, then the people vote on him. That's what Iowa does. In Iowa, we use a combination of the two. Judges are appointed at the state level for their first term, and then if they decide to run for a new term, they're voted on in what we call retention elections by the people. So on your ballot, you'll also see judges on the back, and it's a simple, do you want to retain them or not? There's not candidates, right? And if they get voted out, the governor just appoints a new one and the cycle starts over. The term is 8 years, and there's no limit to the number of terms they can serve. All right, I hope this gave you some insight into the state executive and judicial branches. Be sure to log on to Google Classroom and answer the packet questions that follow this, and have a great week.